Hi folks. Okay, so today's topic is risk management. So we're going to look at first a few different definitions of cybersecurity risk. We're also going to then cover the topics of risk assessment, risk management and risk governance. I'll give you definitions for those, but essentially risk assessment is all about trying to identify and determine how severe a risk is. So we're going to look at some of the problems with evaluating risk that common across basically flaws with human perception and cognition, which lead to us not being very good at evaluating risk intuitively. So we're going to look at ways of actually identifying different risks, different approaches that may be taken, and then seeing how severe the risks, like a particular given investment or a business decision, maybe the risks that are associated with a specific move. Then we're going to be looking at risk management. So this is all about how do we manage risk once we've identified that there is a risk. How do we deal with that? So this can be things like putting in defensive controls, defensive security controls, or changing the design of access controls and things like this. It also covers things like responding to incidents that have happened and making sure that the business continues to run as usual. And then we'll touch on risk governance. So by governance, all we mean is the organizational level processes and procedures that are in place that govern operations, right? So we're talking about how can we implement certain organization-wide policies and procedures in order to manage risk. So we'll be looking at a few different frameworks that are used in order to support risk management at this point. Okay, so defining risk. So we've got two definitions here. One is just the general, we're talking about just the word risk in general now, right? So you've got the first definition just from the Cambridge Dictionary is just the possibility of something bad happening. So this is like a negative definition of risk. So this is the kind of thing that we're generally talking about when we're discussing things risk related to cybersecurity. So there are also, you may find in places that there are positive definitions of risk or ambiguous definitions of risk, which could, for example, this second one from ISO 31000, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So that implies that there could be a positive or negative impact. You'll see this a bunch in when we're talking about businesses and entrepreneurs being people who enjoy taking risks. You can see in gambling, for example, things like that, where there is a potential upside and downside to risk. But when we're talking about risk as it relates to cybersecurity, we're generally talking about negative risk. So here's a definition of cyber risk. So this is from the NIST special publication 800 to 160. This is the risk of depending on cyber resources. So i.e. the risk of depending on a system or system elements that exist or intermittently have a presence in cyberspace. So this is just generally talking about relying on digital systems, which it applies so widely now in society that it touches a lot of ground. Most organizations have at least some element of a system or depend on systems that have a presence in cyberspace, if we're just talking about existing digitally. Okay, so in cybersecurity, we're primarily concerned with negative risk. So these are things like the threats that our system or operation may face from external or internal actors, the vulnerabilities that exist in our systems or organizations. And when we're concerned with risk, we're talking about what kind of impact if there's a risk associated with, for example, a given security investment, or not making a given security investment, which is more likely, or more common, I guess. It's more commonly framed in, if you don't treat security seriously, there is this risk associated with that, which is your systems may be vulnerable to attackers, data may be leaked, your systems may be breached, there may be sensitive information. So there's risks associated with that, and we're interested in how impactful these risks are. So, how we calculate risk. So we can think of this is a way of thinking of risk in general, right? So this calculation that's on the screen now, we go into this more specifically in the lab, where we're actually trying to calculate the impact of a risk. So the risk equation, if we're trying to calculate the risk of something, we're trying to see what the what the probability or the likelihood of a negative outcome is. So how likely is it that this risk manifests? Let's say, for example, we have a risk of, let's say that we're considering whether we should implement like ID badges on the front desk, and a security officer to check the ID badges to make sure that people are going in or out of a building, right? What is the likelihood that there's going to be a negative outcome if we don't implement that? So if we just carry on business as usual. We're also looking at what the impact that the negative outcome has on the situation. So how severe could it be? There's a video that I will link to you in the next week. There's a couple of videos actually about a social engineer who the really, really good, worth watching. It's about a red team physical pen tester who breaks into a hotel. He's paid to do it, and breaks into banks and stuff, in order to see how much damage he can cause. And it can be just not having basic security controls in organizations like that. Even though the likelihood might not be massive, the impact that they have can be huge. So in the example that I was talking about, I won't spoil the video for you, like the outcome of it, but essentially the title is, okay, so I found the video, yeah, so it's called Steal Everything, Kill Everyone and Cause Total Financial Ruin, and it's by a speaker called Jason E. Street. The video is from DEFCON 19, but he's on the same talk at a bunch of different things, so if you search that on YouTube, you can find it. I'll be linking it next week anyway for you to watch as part of your assigned lecture content. But yeah, so the impact could be huge, just based off that title, I suppose. So it all depends on different situations, right? Like, it's very contextual. It all depends on which risk we're trying to calculate. Some things have higher impact and lower likelihood. Some have higher likelihood of an incident and lower impact. And I'll show you a diagram in a minute that gives you an example of this. But for now, I'll breaking this down further. We can see that what do we mean by a negative outcome? So what are the negative outcomes that we're trying to model? So these are essentially threats and vulnerabilities when we're talking about like risk related to anything. It's either a threat from an external threat or a vulnerability, a problem with the system that we're looking at. So we can reframe the likelihood as likelihood of threats and likelihood of vulnerabilities. Okay, so here's an image that I found on Twitter. It's been going around for a bunch of years now. I've seen it a few times, but this is a good way of like modeling risk from or having like a visual representation of understanding the different components of the risk equation that we just looked at. So we looked at probability and impact. We called it likelihood and impact. But yeah, so from the top one, so this is all about like how risky is it to cross this gap. So in the first example, you've got a situation which there's a high probability that you're going to step in the hole, which has a bit of water in the first one. So there's only a low impact. You might get your feet a little bit wet, whatever. For the next one down, you've got low probability, low impact. So in this case, you can more often than not just walk over the gap. But if you do fall in, it's not a big deal. It's only shallow. The next one down is low probability, high impact. So in this case, there is a massive drop and there are some spikes at the bottom. You really don't want to be taking that risk, even though there's very low chance that you do fall down, and you can usually just step over it. If you do make a mistake in this situation, or if an incident occurs in this situation, there is very high negative impact. So you want to take this risk seriously, even though it's not super likely to occur. And the bottom one's high probability, high impact, so there's a huge risk of trying to cross this chasm, I guess. You probably don't want to do that. If you want to think of like a cybersecurity analogy, I guess the bottom one could be something like running like unpatched Windows XP connected to the internet without any firewall or any kind of security mechanisms. It's a high probability that you're going to get attacked, and there's a high impact because your system has some really serious security vulnerabilities. If you think you can think about examples for the others, but yeah, for example, for like a low probability, high impact one, they might be like, there's a low probability that you're going to get a system that's running up to date software, that there's going to be a remote code execution vulnerability on it, for example, something that would compromise your full system. It's not super likely, but it would have a high impact if an incident was to take place. Okay. So that's risk. That's what we're looking at. Now we're talking about security and risk. So what's the relationship between security and risk? So when we're implementing security measures, the whole goal is to try and mitigate risk, or try and handle it, control the risk that's involved with a particular investment or business move, or implementing some kind of new solution or system. So security measures themselves are actually a risk. If you think about it in terms of the fact that they cost money and time and resources to implement, and you have to train people. Like, let's say we've created a new system that's got some security benefits over the old system. You may need to spend that costs money, that costs time. This is a risk because you could be using that time and money elsewhere, and also they may not necessarily be effective in achieving their aim. These are all risks that are associated with managing risk itself. You can't really get away from it. So problems with assessing risk. So as I mentioned earlier, well, risk management comes with there are issues that humans have with assessing risk. So we do this every day. It's very common for us to assess risks. We do it when we have procedures that we follow when we're putting a seatbelt on to mitigate the risk of injury in case of a car accident. We're looking both ways before we cross a road. These are all things that we learn when we're children, but we have to deal with trade-offs and risk. We do risk evaluations all the time. And despite having a lot of practice with this, human intuition, it's not very good at actually accurately assessing risk. So we can feel very secure when we're not very secure, and vice versa. Some examples of these, we have cognitive biases, which are problems where we will exaggerate a risk which has like high impact, and we'll underestimate things which have low impact. So this can be things like evaluating the risk involved in taking a plane to somewhere rather than driving. There have been a bunch of studies and things online which they compare the risk of traveling an equal distance on a plane versus the same distance on a car, and it actually ends up being lower likelihood of an incident using air travel versus the road. But because you're more familiar with the road and you're more comfortable in that situation, there's not as much of like dramatic things like big visual plane crashes on TV, or like terrorist attacks, or there's not as much of like things related like during the process. For example, as you're going through an airport, you're going through all this airport security, there's all this like high alert things that put you on edge, makes you feel like that is a much higher risk than it actually is in reality. So these are things that are called, like, this is generally under the umbrella of like the security theatre. This is a phrase coined by Bruce Schneier, who is an information security expert. He's wrote a bunch of like very important research. He published a textbook called Applied Cryptography. He said cryptography deals with a lot of things to do with cybersecurity and information security risk. And he came up with the idea of security theatre, where this is things like they make you feel like more secure. For example, going through all the airport body scanners and the TSA stuff at airports, makes you feel a lot more secure, but it might not necessarily have the impact that it purports to have. It might not be as effective of a security mechanism as it looks. So yeah, security theatre is essentially like flashy security that makes us feel safe, but it's not very effective. It has a lot of efficacy. So there's an example of this which is quite funny. If you read through this article that is linked, or just search for Wired Xbox Underground hackers, there was a group of hackers who essentially they were really interested in modding Xbox, and there's an example in this story about how one individual he was trying to get into a building because he knew that there were these like development kits for Xbox, for one version of the Xbox, and essentially these development kits didn't have certain security mechanisms on, so you could run unsigned code. You could basically create your own modded version of a game, and it would actually run on the Xbox. Whereas like the Xboxes that were retailed and launched had some security mechanisms in place which prevented any game that wasn't verified from actually running, right? So an example here of like how people can bypass security mechanisms is that there was some development kits on some like upper floor in this office, and it was in some like protected room or whatever, and in order to get up to these higher floors you had to have like a biometric ID. I'm not sure exactly which, you can check the article for the details, but like for example you might have had like an iris scanner or some fingerprint scanner in order to actually access and use the elevator, but they had a fire exit, which you could obviously, for fire safety reasons, you can't like lock that down. So essentially the guy just walked up the fire exit to the appropriate floor and walked into the room, stole the development kits and left, and then went and sold them or shared them with part of this like hacker group that were developing like modded games and pirated Xbox content. So here's an example of like you can make something look very secure and scary, and like, everyone thinks, oh, this is really, really secure. They've got iris scanners. You won't be able to get in here, but then there's just a stairway that you can just walk up. So it's all about managing risk, trying to determine what effective controls are, and trying to identify gaps in your security posture. Okay, so what types of risk can an organisation expose itself to? So here's a list that's from the NIST special publication 839 called Managing Information Security Risk. This comes up with a list of different types. So you've got project management risks, so risks associated with management decisions not going according to plan, not having an adequate plan for how the project should unfold, or maybe there are things that weren't accounted for. Investment risk, so maybe your organisation is deciding to invest in a given security product, or maybe invest in expanding their operations overseas or something. So these would come under investment risks. Budgetary risk, so this is about how well the budget has been defined for the organisation, the financials. So risks that are related to the financial planning of an organisation. And you've got legal liability risk. So for a cybersecurity example, this is things related to, a good example is GDPR. How GDPR is a set of legal requirements that determine how data should be governed and managed, and it has like fines associated with organisations that don't adequately protect their data or handle data in an appropriate way. So there's fines for like breaches, etc. So safety risk. So this is just general risks related to like health and safety issues. Inventory risk. So this could be related to either not having enough stock. Like let's say it's an organisation that's selling some product, they might not have enough. They might not have enough inventory on hand to sell or to meet the sales that they've actually said that they can meet. There's also supply chain risk, which is slightly related. So this is about the risk of maybe their suppliers not being able to keep up with the demand, similar kind of thing. And a security risk. So the security risk is labelled under its own section. So security risk kind of touches on most of the areas within an organisation. There are risks that, like in general, for example, project management risk. This could be impacted by security. Security is kind of cross-cutting across all of these areas, right? Because if there's a security incident that's related to, for example, the inventory, maybe the systems go down that are associated with ordering new stock, or there might be problems in it. Security can hit all levels, really. Okay, so levels of perceived risk. So there are a few different, when we're analysing how risky a situation is, we need to determine whether a risk is not acceptable or intolerable, something that's really bad, we don't want anything to do with that, something that we can avoid more or less, try our best to try and remedy the situation and limit our exposure, or if it's tolerable, so maybe there is a risk associated, but we have implemented measures or mechanisms to try and reduce the risk to a level that is as low as reasonably possible, so that's ALARP, or as low as reasonably acceptable or allowable, so that's ALAR. So these two acronyms are used to determine the level at which we can reduce the risk to. So the way we want to handle these risks is using reasonable and appropriate methods, and we'll be going into these in the lab. The difference between these terms, but we're looking at risk mitigation, risk sharing, risk transfer. We'll be talking about these in more depth in a few slides time. But maybe the level of perceived risk for something is acceptable. Maybe we don't need to reduce the risk. We've accepted or we've embraced the risk that's associated with something. It may be that we've gone and we've done a risk assessment, or we've done some cost-benefit analysis. We've figured out that a particular investment is actually likely to be worth taking the risk, so we'll accept it. We'll accept the risk. But the question is, like, to who is perceiving the risk? So this is the key point of trying to. This is where most of the benefit from learning about risk assessment and the way that businesses talk about risk, and it's essentially what you need to do is you need to make sure that the business executives understand the risks associated with a given investment or not making a given investment, as the case may be. So the main benefit of learning about this stuff is so that you can fight your case, I guess. If you're a cybersecurity operative and you know that there is a risk associated with not implementing something like, for example, regular patching, you might be working on in an environment where there are many out-of-date systems that have various vulnerabilities. You might see that there's, we need to keep our systems up to date. That's pretty good standard practice. And you go along and you tell one of the business executives about this, and they don't care. Why? Because it costs money, right? It costs money to implement, and it costs money, it costs time, it costs resources to implement this change, and they don't, like, from a business perspective, the end goal is always to maximize profits and make money. It's all about generating as much money as you can for the organization while keeping costs low, as much revenue as you can while minimizing costs. And if this is an extra cost, well, how are you going to convince them that it's a cost that's worth investing in? So this is all. This is what doing risk assessment and talking about cyber risk in monetary terms and financial terms. That's what it's all about. So this is one of the big benefits of GDPR. Actually, when GDPR came in, it gives people that work in cybersecurity a weapon to wield and fight the battle with the business folk, and basically say, look, here is the downside if we do have a breach and we haven't been handling data correctly. We're now exposed to legal risk. We're not just like operating with bad practices and exposing ourselves to potential reputational damage. We are actually going to incur like fines as well. So this is all about framing the debate that you're having about maybe we should invest in a new security mechanism, or maybe we should change our policies in this way rather than keep them the same. And it's going to cost X amount over time in terms of training costs, in terms of the equipment required, whatever the case may be. You weigh up the costs versus the benefits. So the benefits are that you're not exposing yourself to these potential huge fines that you may incur if you have a breach. So you need to it's all about trying to frame things in terms of the bottom line, like how is this going to impact the financials? How could it impact the financials if we didn't do X, Y, or Z? Okay, so how do we identify risks? So here are a few techniques that essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out what the threats and vulnerabilities associated with a particular investment or a venture that the business is taking. We're trying to find out what the impact is. So the impact, we broke it down earlier into the vulnerabilities and threats. We're also trying to figure out what the likelihood is, but that comes in the next stage. So for now, we're just trying to basically brainstorm and figure out what all of the risks that we can come up with that may be associated with a particular business move are. So some of the techniques we can do, we can brainstorm, we can interview people that are involved, like staff members that are using the systems that we're interested in, or we can have people that design the systems. We want to basically try and get as broad a perspective as possible on what the risks are that are associated. So another way we can do it is we can do source analysis. So we can look at the sources of risk. So there may be risks associated with being in competition with other organizations. There may be external threats that may not be related to competition. It might just be bad actors, like hackers, people having fun, that are not necessarily trying to like trying to attack your business from like a competitive standpoint. There's also internal threats, so you might have disgruntled employees or ex-employees. What are the risks associated with firing an employee? Are you immediately removing them from the building and revoking all IT access? That's pretty standard in like behavior in a business setting. In order to minimize the amount of risk, because if they've just been fired, then they're unpredictable. They might not necessarily just leave. They may try and cause as much damage as they can on the way out because they're unhappy that they've just lost their job or whatever. So there's problem analysis. So this is just related to a general broader threat. So for example, what's the risk with if we lose too much money, if we don't get enough sales in this particular period, etc. And there's common risks, just risks that are not specific to cybersecurity or within or specific to any business that we might be looking at. Just general things like power outages. There might be health and safety risks, just general common risks. And we've also got business specific risks that are specific to whatever domain that the business is working within. So these are related to the business's objectives. So as an example, the risks associated with running a cyber physical system, for example, are different from just running like an online retailer. They have a completely different context and risk profile. So once we've identified all the risks, we need to do some risk assessment. We need to assess the risks and evaluate how serious are these risks, what is the magnitude of them. So the elements of risk, as we already looked at before, and you'll be going through this in the lab. You've got a group activity where you're evaluating a fictitious company. You're doing a risk assessment on it. You can come up with the parameters, so you can decide what industry your company's in, how big it is, how many employees, etc. And then you have to evaluate the risks associated with that. So in order to do that, you'll have to come up with a set of risks, as we just mentioned in the previous slide. You can use some of those techniques. And then when you've got your list of risks, you need to determine how likely they are to occur, what the impact would be on a scale of 1 to 10. Is it very serious? Is it not? How much would it cost the business, or if a particular risk were to materialize? So let's say that one of the risks might be that your web server is at risk of being a denial of service attack, for example. In that case, how long will it, how much of an impact on the bottom line would having, like, for example, let's say you were just a purely web retail store, it's going to have a lot more of an impact than if you are primarily like a brick and mortar store on the high street and then you have a web page associated with it. If it goes down for an hour, how much does that cost you? If it goes down for a week, how much does that cost you? How much is one incident? We then use these elements to do some calculations, so we can calculate the risk impact or the magnitude, like how big of a risk is this. So we do this by multiplying whatever the likelihood is, the percentage, how likely it is for an incident to occur, by the impact. And then we can work out how much we're expected to lose if we multiply the cost per incident by the likelihood. The likelihood is in a year for how likely is this thing to happen. Over the course of a year, we can find out how much financially where the organisation stands to lose. Once we've determined, we've done a bit of a risk assessment, we figured out how much we're expected to lose if we don't make certain changes. We've now got some numbers to back up our argument, right? So when we're looking at risk management, it's super important to have executive support or buy-in from the business, because at the end of the day, it's the business that determines whether what decisions to make, the business executives, right? It's not necessarily the security organisation, the security department. So you want the organisation to be accountable for a given risk, right? And this might mean that they are going to assist in establishing new programs or organisation level processes. This kind of comes into the risk governance stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute. But you want support from the organisation, because they're the ones that give you the resources that you need to implement either new security controls or like come up with these processes. And at the end of the day, they're the ones that decide what the acceptable level of risk is. We had those 3 levels of perceived risk before. It's not really up to this, depending on. It's not really, at the end of the day, it falls on the business to decide whether they're going to invest or not in a given security mechanism or program of training. And if they decide that they don't think it's worth the risk, they may think that it's actually better to just continue as usual, and they're just going to accept the fact that if they do have a breach, then the chips will fall where they may. At the end of the day, there's not much that you can do about it other than argue your case, and your best bet at arguing your case is doing it in a financial way. So you will lose X money more. It's this likely that it's going to cost this much more to not invest versus invest, or maybe it may not. Depends. It's all contextual. Okay, so this is a process diagram for risk management. So risk management is a continual process. It doesn't stop. It's non-linear. It doesn't follow a specific loop. You've got 4 different components, right? So when we're talking about framing, we're about like the strategic plan, the high-level plan, This can relate to all of the other components. So we're talking about assessment. So we're trying to assess what the possible risks to the organisation could be. And with respond, we're planning our response to the risks. So how are we going to handle a situation if a risk manifests? And monitor. So we've got monitoring. So we're continually looking at the state of the risks, and we're trying to we're trying to detect any changes. This is a continual process. Okay, so now risk governance. So this is all about how an organisation manages risk. So I mentioned this previously, but what we're talking about here is what are the policies and procedures that an organisation implements in order to handle risk that may arise. So this could be anything from just implementing a security control in a software application to like physical, having like man traps at the entrance to the office door so that you have to go through. So you're being like inspected on the way in. So organizations generally aim to follow best practices, right? So we're trying to either implement like risk management frameworks or standards, or adhere to them. So an example of this is ISO 27005. That should say 2018, not 2108. The 2018 document. And other approaches are to include like living documents, living actual planning documents, things like enterprise architecture governance. There are a bunch of frameworks and methodologies for implementing this, but this is essentially just a live document that keeps track of the state of the business and any risks that are associated with it. It's a broader document than the information security architecture governance document, which is related specifically to risks with cybersecurity. So when we're talking about risk governance, one of the main issues related to governance of risk in an organization is actually communicating the risk. Specifically when we're talking about cybersecurity, it's like we're trying our best to make everyone in the organization aware that their role is important and that they should adhere to security policy. So like the most common reasons for not adhering to security policy are one, the employee thinks that there's an impact in the way of productivity for them. Like for example, the security mechanism is making it harder for them to do the job, so they just bypass the security control because they think that it's more important to be productive and get the job done rather than adhere to the security control. So they're not really sure of why the security control exists. They also generally one of the other most common reasons is that they perceive the risk of them not adhering to the security control as unimportant. It's not going to matter. Nothing, like if I don't follow this this particular procedure or policy, well, it's nothing major is going to happen to the organization. I'm just a receptionist, whatever it may be. Those are generally the problems. So in order to improve on this situation, we need to install like training programs and improve our communication from the security team to just the average employee, just the people that are involved, the stakeholders in the organization. So the main way we can impact one of the main ways we can address this problem is to try and instill confidence and importance in the employees, make it clear to them that it's generally a problem of understanding. Like they don't realize what not following a given procedure might happen, the impact that might have. So you need to the way that training programs generally work out, they're trying to change the behavior of the end user, and they're trying to do that. The most effective ways of doing that are to try and instill a sense of importance in the employee and show that if they don't do what they're supposed to do in regards to a specific security policy, or if they're not vigilant, then bad things can happen, and they actually can happen, and it's not just unimportant. The risk is not low just because you perceive it. Like we talked earlier about the problems with the limitations of like humans and just like intuitively being able to understand risk. Like you shouldn't rely like these policies and procedures are there for a reason. Businesses wouldn't implement things just to make it more difficult to get your job done if they didn't have a good reason for that. So one example, I guess, of these kinds of programs that have been popping up more and more recently are these like secret shoppers for phishing emails, where it's actually like an internal security organization that's sending out phishing emails to their own like colleagues in order to try and see if they're going to if they're going to report as the email as like suspected phishing, or if they're going to actually like enter the credentials. So these are some of the types of things that can be done, but others are just like general, typical training programs, trying to just improve the understanding of the people in the organisation. Okay, thank you.